September 1944. The war in the Pacific was moving fast. We were winning. We had taken Saipan, Tinian, Guam. The road to the Philippines was open. But there was a small speck of coral in the Palau chain that General Douglas MacArthur wanted neutralized. It was called Paliliu. Major General William Rupertus, the commander of the 1st Marine Division, stood on the deck of his command ship and addressed his officers. He was confident. He was arrogant. He told them, "This is going to be a quickie. Rough but fast. We'll be done in 3 days. Maybe 2. 3 days." Those words would become the most tragic joke in Marine Corps history. We believed him. We were the old breed. The veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. We thought we had seen it all. We thought we knew how to kill Japanese. We looked at the island from the troop ships. It was burning. For 3 days, the Navy had unleashed the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment of the war. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded that tiny island until it looked like a smoking cinder. Admiral Oldendorf announced, "We have run out of targets." We thought nothing could survive that firestorm. We thought we would be walking onto a graveyard. We were wrong. We weren't walking into a graveyard. We were walking into a fortress. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had changed the rules. He didn't put his men on the beaches to die under the naval guns like on Tarawa or Saipan. He gave up the beach. He moved his 11,000 men inland, into the ridges. Paliliu wasn't a normal island. It was a volcanic uplift covered in jagged coral. The Japanese had hollowed out the mountains. They dug 500 caves. They connected them with tunnels. They installed steel blast doors. They had electricity, ventilation, and hospitals underground. While our battleships were pounding the surface, Nakagawa's men were sitting safely underground, playing cards, sharpening their bayonets, and waiting for us to come ashore. D-Day. September 15th, 08:30 hours. The Amtraks, amphibious tractors, hit the reef. We churned toward the beaches, White Beach and Orange Beach. The sun was already blinding. The white coral sand reflected the heat like a mirror. At 200 yards out, the silence broke. The Japanese opened fire, not with rifles but with heavy artillery and mortars pre-sighted on the reef. The water turned into a cauldron of white spray and red blood. Amtraks were blown out of the water, spilling burning Marines into the lagoon. We scrambled over the gunnels, dragging our gear through chest-deep water. When we hit the sand, the nightmare truly began. From the high ground on our left, a place we would soon call the Point, Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns and heavy machine guns raked the beach in a devastating crossfire. There was no cover. The sand was too hard to dig into. It was solid coral rock just inches below the surface. Men were cut in half. Whole squads were wiped out before they could fire a shot. The heat was instantaneous. It wasn't just hot, it was an oven. 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The air shimmered. You sweated out all the water in your body in the first hour. We lay there, pinned down, lips cracking, watching our friends die, and we realized with a sinking horror, this wasn't going to take 3 days. This was going to take forever. By the second day, we had secured a fragile toehold on the beach, but the objective was the airfield, a massive open strip of white coral that cut across the southern end of the island. To take the island, we had to take the airfield. The order came down. Assault across the strip. It was madness.
Disgusting.
Imagine a flat, open plain, 1,000 yards wide with absolutely no cover. No trees, no rocks, just flat, blinding white coral. And looking down on this plain, from the north, was the Umurbrogol mountain range. The Bloody Nose Ridge. The Japanese had hundreds of caves overlooking the airfield. They had artillery, mortars, and heavy machine guns pointed right at us. We were asked to run across a shooting gallery. The 1st and 5th Marines stepped off. It was like the charge of the Light Brigade, but without horses. We ran into a wall of steel. The noise was a continuous roar. Men dropped in rows. It looked like a scythe cutting wheat. There was nowhere to hide. If you stopped, you died. If you ran, you died. I saw a Marine get hit by a heavy machine gun round. It spun him around like a rag doll. I saw an artillery shell land in the middle of a squad. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but red mist and boots. It was the fastest, most violent 30 minutes of my life. We made it to the other side, but we left a carpet of bodies on that white coral. And then, the thirst set in. The heat on Peleliu was a weapon as deadly as the Japanese. The sun reflected off the white rock, cooking us in our uniforms. We ran out of water. Our canteens were dry. Our tongues swelled in our mouths. Men started to collapse from heat stroke. They would just fall over, unconscious. Their faces beet red. The logistics train was in chaos. We called for water. Finally, supplies arrived. We saw the 55-gallon drums being rolled off the Amtraks. Water, water. We pried the lids off. We dipped our cups in. We drank greedily. And then we spat it out, gagging. The drums hadn't been cleaned properly. They had been used to store oil. The water was contaminated. It tasted of diesel and rust. But we were so desperate, some men drank it anyway. And then they got sick. Retching, vomiting, convulsing with cramps in the middle of a firefight. It was a cruel joke. Surrounded by the ocean, dying of thirst, drinking oil. By the end of the first week, the 1st Marine Division was bleeding to death. We had taken the airfield, but the real battle, the battle for the caves, hadn't even started. We looked up at the jagged ridges of the Brogal. They looked like the teeth of a dragon, and we knew we had to go up there. After the airfield, we looked up at the high ground. The maps called it the Brogal Pocket. We called it Bloody Nose Ridge. It wasn't a normal mountain range. It was a twisted, jagged upheaval of coral limestone, looking like the spine of a prehistoric monster. The terrain was alien. The coral was razor sharp. If you tripped and fell, you didn't just get a bruise. You got deep lacerations that festered in the heat within hours. Boots were shredded in days. And hidden inside this nightmare landscape were Colonel Nakagawa's 10,000 men. They had abandoned the Bushido code of the Banzai charge. They weren't going to die for the Emperor in a glorious field of open battle. They were going to make us come in and dig them out, one by one. They had transformed the natural caves into concrete reinforced bunkers. They had overlapping fields of fire. You could be pinned down by a machine gun you couldn't see, and if you tried to flank it, you walked right into the sights of another sniper. We couldn't use our speed. We couldn't use our maneuverability. We had to use the most brutal tactic in the book: blowtorch and corkscrew. The corkscrew was the demolition team, men carrying satchel charges of high explosives. The blowtorch was the flamethrower. I will never forget the sound of a flamethrower firing. It's a deep, terrifying whoosh, like a jet engine starting up next to your ear. The operator carries 2 heavy tanks on his back, one with napalm, one with compressed gas. He is a walking bomb. If a sniper bullet hits those tanks, he doesn't just die, he becomes a human torch, incinerating everyone around him. Because of this, the flamethrower man was the priority target for every Japanese soldier. He had a life expectancy measured in minutes. We would suppress a cave entrance with machine gun fire. Then, the operator would crawl up, heavy and clumsy. He would stick the nozzle into the dark mouth of the cave and pull the trigger. A stream of liquid fire, burning at 2,000 degrees, would spray into the darkness. The result was instant oxygen depletion. The fire sucked the air out of the lungs of anyone inside. Then came the screams. It wasn't war, it was extermination. Sometimes burning men would run out of the caves, their uniforms on fire, flailing wildly before they were cut down by our rifles. We watched this with a mixture of horror and satisfaction. We hated them for killing our friends. But seeing a human being burn, it takes a piece of your soul that you never get back. The fighting was measured in yards. We would spend all day taking a ridge, losing 50 men to take 50 feet. We would drag our bodies up the sharp coral, gasping in the 115-degree heat. And then, when night fell, they would come back. Infiltrators. Creepers. They didn't scream Banzai. They moved silently. They wore tabi socks. split-toed rubber shoes that made no sound on the rock. They would slip into our foxholes with knives. The nights on Bloody Nose Ridge were a test of sanity. You couldn't sleep. You stared into the blackness until your eyes watered. Every shadow looked like a man. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a knife being drawn. We became paranoid. We threw grenades at rocks. We shot at tree stumps. I remember a young private next to me. He had been awake for 3 days. He started talking to his mother in the middle of the night. Quietly at first, then louder. "I'm coming home, Mom. Put the kettle on." He stood up and walked out of the foxhole into the darkness. A single shot rang out, then silence. We didn't go get him until morning. The stalemate dragged on. September turned into October. The 3-day operation was now in its 3rd week. The 1st Marine Division was disintegrating. Regiments that had landed with 3,000 men were down to 900 effectives. Companies were commanded by sergeants because all the lieutenants and captains were dead. We were dirty, bearded, covered in coral sores and jungle rot. We looked like cavemen fighting a prehistoric war. And still, Nakagawa held the ridge. We brought in the tanks, the Sherman Zippos with flamethrowers mounted in the turret. They rumbled up the narrow valleys, blasting fire into the cliffs. But the Japanese had 47mm anti-tank guns hidden behind steel doors. They would wait for a tank to expose its flank, open the doors, fire a round, and close the doors before we could react. We saw tanks burning, crews trapped inside screaming over the radio. It was a meat grinder, a slow grinding machine that chewed up American youth and spit out bones. We started to ask the question that no one dared to say out loud. Why are we here? Is this island worth it? General Rupertus refused to relieve us. He was obsessed with finishing the job. He kept sending decimated units back up the hill. It wasn't until mid-October, when the division was combat ineffective, destroyed as a fighting force, that the order finally came. Stand down. The Army's taking over. We looked at each other. We were too tired to cheer. We just stared at the hills that had killed so many of us, and we felt a hollow, bitter emptiness. We were leaving, but we were leaving our ghosts behind on that ridge. By the 4th week, Peleliu had ceased to be a battle. It had become a duel. It was no longer about taking territory. It was about hunting ghosts. The Umabrogol ridges were a maze of death. You could stare at a cliff face for hours and see nothing but white coral and blackened stumps. But the moment you moved, a bullet would snap past your ear. The Japanese snipers on Peleliu were unlike any soldiers we had ever fought. They didn't shoot to suppress. They shot to kill. And they had infinite patience. They would tie themselves high up in the few remaining trees, camouflaged with palm fronds, their bodies swaying with the wind. They would remain there for days, urinating in their pants, drinking rainwater from leaves, waiting for one perfect shot. Their favorite target wasn't the point man. It was the corpsman, or the radio man, or the officer. They knew if they killed a medic, 3 other Marines would rush out to drag him back. Then they would kill the rescuers. It was a cold, mathematical calculation of war. We learned to move like lizards. We crawled on our bellies over the sharp coral until our uniforms were shredded and our chests were raw. We stopped wearing rank insignias. We stopped saluting officers. In the Umabrogol, everyone was equal in the crosshairs. But the true horror wasn't what was happening outside. It was what was happening inside the mountain. We began to uncover the entrances to the cave systems. Some were small, just big enough for a man to squeeze through. Others were massive caverns housing artillery pieces on railroad tracks. When we blew open a cave, usually with a satchel charge or a bulldozer, we would send in the tunnel rats. Small, wiry Marines armed with a flashlight and a .45 pistol. What they found inside was a vision of hell. The Japanese soldiers were living like troglodytes. The air inside the caves was foul, a mixture of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food, and the acrid smoke of cordite. They had no water. The U.S. Navy had cut off their supply lines weeks ago. We found diaries on the bodies. They wrote of licking the condensation off the cave walls to survive. They wrote of dreaming of snow in Tokyo while they baked in the oven of Peleliu. But despite the starvation, despite the thirst, their discipline held. Colonel Nakagawa had ordered, every man must kill 10 Americans before he dies. And they were trying to fulfill that quota. We found wounded Japanese soldiers lying on stretchers deep underground, clutching grenades to their chests, waiting for us to get close enough to pull the pin. We found officers who had committed seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than surrender, their bodies arranged in neat rows. It wasn't just an army we were fighting, it was a cult of death. The stress on the Marines was reaching a breaking point. We call it PTSD now. Back then, they called it combat fatigue or the 1,000-yard stare. I saw it in the faces of my friends. Men who had been joking and laughing on the boat ride over were now silent. They sat in their foxholes, staring at nothing, their hands shaking uncontrollably. Some men just snapped. They would stand up in the middle of a firefight and start screaming, or they would curl up into a ball and refuse to move. We didn't judge them. We envied them. Because for them, the war was over. For the rest of us, we had to get up and assault the next ridge. The nights were the worst. The Japanese infiltrators, the wolves, would come down from the ridges.
Everything is peaceful here.
They didn't want to capture the airfield anymore. They just wanted to kill. They would slip into our lines and slit throats. They would throw grenades into our sleeping holes. We developed a trigger-happy paranoia. If a land crab scurried across the coral, 20 Marines would open fire. We threw grenades at shadows. We were sleep-deprived hallucinations. I remember seeing a tree stump turn into a Japanese soldier in my mind. I shot it 5 times. The line between reality and nightmare had vanished. As we pushed deeper into the pocket, the terrain got worse. The China Wall, the 5 Sisters, these were names we gave to the jagged peaks. We had to hoist 37mm anti-tank guns up vertical cliffs using ropes and pulleys, while under fire. We used bulldozers as tanks, welding steel plates to the cabs, driving them right up to the cave mouths to bury the Japanese alive. It was brutal, industrial slaughter. We were erasing them from the earth. But every time we sealed a cave, we wondered, how many are left? Nakagawa was still in there, somewhere deep in the heart of the mountain, moving his command post from cave to cave, directing the last stand. He sent a final radio message to Tokyo. Our swords are broken and we have run out of spears. But he didn't surrender. He burned the regimental colors. He prepared for the end. And we, the Marines of the 1st Division, we were broken too. We were ghosts of the men who had landed on D-Day. We were hollowed out by the heat and the death. We just wanted it to end. But on Peleliu, the end was always one more ridge away. By mid-October 1944, the 1st Marine Division was a ghost of its former self. The old breed had been bled white. The 1st Marines Regiment had suffered 58% casualties. The 5th Marines, nearly 50%. The 7th Marines, similar. We were no longer an effective fighting force. We were a collection of walking skeletons, suffering from dysentery, heat exhaustion, and shell shock. General Rupertus finally, reluctantly, handed over command to the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats. When the Army troops arrived, fresh and clean, they were shocked by what they saw. They saw Marines who looked like old men, their eyes hollow, their uniforms stiff with dried blood and coral dust. We walked down to the beach to leave. We didn't look back. We didn't wave goodbye. We just wanted to get off that rock. We wanted to forget the smell of rotting bodies that permeated every inch of the island. As the ships pulled away, we felt a strange mix of relief and survivor's guilt. We were leaving the job unfinished. Nakagawa was still in there. The 81st Division approached the problem differently. They didn't have the Marines' obsession with speed. They had time, and they had heavy equipment. They turned the siege of the Umabrogal into an industrial engineering project. They brought in bulldozers to build ramps up the sheer cliffs. They brought in cranes to lift howitzers. They laid pipelines, not for water, but for oil. They pumped thousands of gallons of diesel fuel and napalm directly into the cave systems through ventilation shafts. Then they ignited it. The explosions were muffled deep underground, but smoke would pour out of 100 fissures in the rock. It was a slow, methodical suffocation of the enemy. They used sandbags to inch their way forward, creating mobile walls of protection. They moved 10 yards a day. It took another 6 weeks. 6 weeks of grinding, close quarters combat to clear the final pocket. Deep inside the mountain, in the final command cave, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa knew the end was near. He had held out for 73 days. He had promised the Emperor he would make the Americans pay for every inch, and he had kept his word. His 11,000 men were gone. Only 50 were left alive in the command post. They were starving, drinking muddy water, many dying of gangrene from untreated wounds. On the night of November 24, 1944, Nakagawa sent his final dispatch to Tokyo. "Our sword is broken and we have run out of spears. We have burnt the regimental colors. We will not surrender." He ordered the remaining able-bodied soldiers to launch a final gyokusai, a suicide charge. Then, in the flickering light of a candle, deep in the bowels of the earth, Colonel Nakagawa and Major Kenjiro Mirai knelt down. They performed the ritual of seppuku. They shot themselves in the head. The next morning, November 25th, the 81st Division finally broke into the last cave. The Battle of Peleliu was officially over, but the tragedy of Peleliu wasn't just the death toll, it was the reason. Why did we fight there? We were told the airfield was critical to protect General MacArthur's flank as he invaded the Philippines. But here is the bitter truth. MacArthur invaded the Philippines before Peleliu was even secured. The airfield on Peleliu was never used for any major strategic operation. It was a sideshow. The Japanese Navy had already been neutralized. We could have bypassed Peleliu. We could have let Nakagawa and his men rot on the vine, cut off from supplies until they surrendered or starved. Island hopping was supposed to mean skipping the hard targets. Instead, we attacked the hardest target of them all. The cost was staggering. 1,800 Americans killed, 8,000 wounded, 10,695 Japanese killed, only 202 captured, and most of those were Korean laborers, not soldiers. An entire division of the United States Marine Corps was wrecked for a rock that didn't matter. For decades, Peleliu was the forgotten battle. It didn't have the famous flag raising of Iwo Jima. It didn't have the strategic importance of Okinawa. It was an embarrassment to the high command, a mistake they wanted to bury. But the men who fought there couldn't forget. Eugene Sledge, a young mortarman who survived the battle, wrote his memoirs years later on scraps of paper tucked into a Bible. He wrote about the terror, the waste, and the inhumanity of man to man. He wrote about digging foxholes through corpses. He wrote about the 1,000-yard stare. He wrote, "We were the victims of a war of attrition that had no end and no meaning other than to kill or be killed." Years later, veterans returned to the island. The jungle had grown back. The scars on the coral were covered in vines. They walked into the caves. They found rusted helmets, canteens, and the bones of the Japanese defenders still lying where they fell. They found peace, not in the victory, but in the silence. They realized that their sacrifice wasn't for the generals, or for the airfield, or for the strategy. It was for the man on their left and the man on their right. The Marines of Peleliu fought because they were Marines. They endured the unendurable because they refused to let their brothers down. That is the legacy of the old breed. It isn't a story of glory. It is a story of endurance. It is a story of the human spirit pushed to the absolute breaking point and holding on. This concludes our series on the Pacific War, the nightmare of Guadalcanal, the horror of Tarawa, and the tragedy of Peleliu. If you have watched this far, you are now a witness to their story. Do not let them be forgotten. Please subscribe to Beneath the Metal for more untold history. Semper Fidelis.